Sound matters. Be heard. Welcome to the podcast where you get exclusive behind-the-scenes tips to make your own show sound truly spectacular. This is Podtastic Audio.
Hey, what's happening? How are you doing today? I want to say thank you so much for being here today. I am Chris of the Chris and Christine Show podcast. You can find out all about that show at chrisandchristineshow.com. And if you can't remember that, which sounds pretty easy if you ask me, there will be a link to that into the show notes of today's episode. Don't you even worry. And I'm here to help you with your podcast. In fact, Podtastic Audio, the show you're listening to right now, the one you push play on, yeah, I designed this show to help you design your show. That is it. That is the only reason this show exists, is just to help you. Only because people were asking me when I was on the Chris and Christine show, in fact, I still am, but a couple years ago, people would ask me through Twitter or social media of some kind. They say, hey, how do you make your show sound so great? What are you doing? How do you do this? How do you do that? Every guest you have on, it sounds like you guys are all in the same room hanging out. Like, how do you even do that? Well, of course, I responded to those emails and those messages and stuff. But then I'm like, you know what? Why don't I just start another podcast? I already got the gear. I'll start this show designed to help you so you can hear me say what I'm saying. And you actually can hear it, and I can talk about it, and I can tell you the things that I have used, the things I have tried that didn't work, things that do work. I am always very honest with you, the listener. Like, I tell you everything as it is. Like, I don't BS you. I don't put on a fake persona. I don't try to tell you things that didn't happen. I don't say, oh, well, I did this and I did that and I'm blah, blah, blah. No, I keep it real around here. Very honest, very truthful. And I think you should do the same thing for your podcast. But you can do podcasting however you want to do it. It's your show. Don't let me or anybody else tell you how to do your show. But I'm saying, if you want the listener that listens to your show, whoever they are, if you want them to really like you and trust you, then you got to be honest with them. And it's okay. Even if it's a little screw up. If you screw up on something and make a mistake, just be honest about it. But if you blatantly lie to the listeners over and over and over again, and they find out or something happens and comes out or whatever, trust me, it's all going to come crashing down because people don't want to listen to people that are lying to them. That's the truth right there. So today on Podtastic Audio, I have a fantastic guest all about the podcast production and audio engineering. That's right. My guest today is Chris Curran of the Podcast Engineering School, where he actually helps out people like you and me figure out how to make a podcast sound incredible. Not just the basic USB Blue Yeti kind of stuff. I'm talking like some serious audio production type stuff. He's been in the business for over 30 years doing audio production. Like, that's his stuff. He is a sound engineer. That's his whole deal. So, without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Chris Curran of the Podcast Engineering School.
Hey, Chris, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, got one Chris to another Chris, man.
Yes.
Hey, so Chris, where in the world are you physically joining me today?
Colorado Springs. I've lived here for the past 7 years, and before that, I lived my entire life in northern New Jersey.
What made you make the move to Colorado? Did you want more snow or what?
No, we visited Alaska in 2014, and Alaska is just amazing, the nature, because my wife and I love nature. We love meditating and all that stuff. So when we visited Alaska, we had a great time, and we came back to our little apartment in northern New Jersey, and we walked in the door, and I kind of looked at her and I basically said, why do we live here again? and so then we decided, let's go move somewhere where there's nature and mountains and stuff. So Colorado Springs ended up to be the place, and we love it.
That's fantastic. Now, are you like out like at a farm, like way out in the middle of nowhere? You got to like hike to the store to get anything?
No. Colorado Springs is a medium-sized city, and we live, on the outskirts of the city. We live right at the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. So the mountains are right here, and the city's right here. It's not a big city, but it's a city, and it's the best of both worlds, pretty much.
As we record this, it's November. Are you seeing any snowfall yet?
Yeah, we've gotten a couple, quarter inch or half an inch of snow. We've gotten a few of them already. Yeah.
Oh, are you a big snow guy? You like go skiing or snowboarding or like that?
No, not really, but we do go hiking. So we really like hiking, and we like going in the winter. We put those things on our feet. I forget what you call them.
They're like snow screen doors, right? They're
like, I think crampons are the ones when people actually do like Mount Everest climbing. They call them crampons, but there's like there's a more friendly version for average people, and you just put it over your boots, and it helps you grip.
Oh, okay. So you don't have to like.
The name.
So it's like the ones I'm thinking look like tennis rackets. That's what I'm thinking of.
Oh yeah, no, not that. These are like things you just literally strap it onto the sole of your boot, and it just provides a lot of grip. Yeah.
Oh, it's like a sock or something that goes around it, kind of like a rubber.
No, it goes over your boot. It's hard to explain, but.
Yeah, see, I'm down here in San Diego, and believe it or not, we do get snow every once in a while, but it's like only in the high mountains, and we're talking like a few inches, just enough to make the kind of like make it look pretty, I guess. But that's about it, really. So I'm not a big snow guy or whatever, as you might imagine. So Chris, you've been in audio. Is your title an actual audio engineer? Is that what you classify yourself as?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I went to school for it in the early 90s, and then I went to New York, and I worked in a lot of the big studios engineering. So yeah, I'm an audio engineer.
So when you go to audio engineering, is it a specific school just for that, or just a course in the school for that?
I went to a specific school for it in Ohio. So it was I think it was like a 10-week or 12-week program. So it just kind of gave you the basics. And then I attended that, and it was great. And then I, like I said, I started out as an intern in New York City, and I spent 4 or 5 years in New York working my way up the ladder and learning by doing and all that. It was great.
So were you like recording bands or what?
Yeah. So mainly the studios I worked at were not tracking studios. They were more mixing studios. Although of course we did have some live rooms, and we did some tracking, and of course we did a lot of overdubs too, but it was a lot of overdubbing and mixing. And I worked on at least 80% of what I worked on was rap, which I didn't mind, but after a while it gets a little, but I was, happy I got to meet Biggie and Puffy and
look at
ton
that.
of people.
Do you have like
photos,
a lot of pictures and selfies and stuff?
Actually, no. Back then, pictures and selfies weren't a thing, especially when you're working at the studio and they're the client. Like it's kind of rude to be like, oh, can I take a picture with you?
Well, I just noticed like all the radio stations, every time a morning show's got a big celebrity of any kind come through the studio, their selfies are posted on their social media, the same morning or whatever. I was wondering if you guys did the same thing over there, but I guess you got to be professional when you have.
Well, no, but don't forget, back in 1992, 93, there were no cell phones.
That's true. Yeah. So where would you see it?
No internet, really.
That's true, huh?
Yeah. Nothing.
Wow. Back in the day. Now, were you doing things on like analog recorder on actual like 10 tracks? Well, how many tracks were they recording on actual tape on?
Yeah, everything was analog tape. So the standard recording was a 24-track tape machine.
Okay, yeah.
And sometimes you would lock 2 of them together to get 48 tracks. Those are for bigger productions.
No way.
And then when you mix it down onto a 2-track analog tape. So that a 1/2-inch tape, 2 tracks. And so it was great. A lot of analog saturation and natural compression that way, which was obviously made a huge difference. That's why pretty much all plug-in manufacturers these days are trying to emulate that tape feeling.
Yeah, when I was in college, I actually did a studio sound recording. Was a class I took too, and I recorded a band. We had an 8-track machine. I remember analog. I forget the mixing console, how big it was, but it seemed big to me at the time. I don't know how big it was, but it was all analog, of course. And then we mixed it down into this little thin, like tape. I'm not sure it was pretty thin though. It was a reel-to-reel, but I remember the width of it. It wasn't an inch. It was probably like a 1/2 inch. You know what size I'm talking about?
Yeah, usually it's either a 1/2 inch or 1/4 inch.
Something like that. I remember the thing was they give you this reel that you're done with your project. You take it home with you, and I'm like, okay, great. How am I going to play this?
Exactly.
I have to go back to the studio, back into the class, and actually figure out what it puts on a cassette tape back in the day and all that. So So when you were around getting started, I'm sure cassettes were all the rage still, or CDs still kind of coming out. I know you couldn't record to a CD as easily as a cassette. It wasn't as, I guess, easy to get a hold of, right? Back then?
Yeah, well, the early 90s, I mean, obviously CDs were a thing, of course. They were huge by then, and they had already taken over analog, cassette tapes. But yeah, CD burners were kind of rare. In the studio, we used to just record backups to DAT tape, which is digital audio tape. And then we used to make cassettes for people to play in their cars, because CD players in cars were not that common. I mean, they kind of were, but they weren't.
Oh, you were a rich kid if you had a CD player in your car. I mean, yeah, you were. that was like, I remember going to high school. The kids who had the CD player in their car. Oh gosh, they were like, everyone's jealous, and they'd oh, check out my book of CD. I got 500 CDs in my trunk, in back of my back seat of my car. And if it gets broken into, I'm screwed. I remember those days. I know that when digital audio kind of started going to the MP3 format, and now of course. The iPod was, huge, and then of course every player had to copy the iPod kind of style and stuff, and then now everything's just streaming and stuff. Do you think that's kind of a good thing for audio or for music, or do you think it's kind of just convenient? I know the gaming's convenient now, but I know the audio isn't quite as great. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, in a way, it is what it is. Things change, times change, the technology gets updated, and and. It just is what it is. I mean, honestly, well, and there's a reason why we're seeing a resurgence of vinyl right now too, right?
Oh, yeah, I have a vinyl player, and so I've got some stuff, but the records are so damn expensive. My goodness, for a vinyl record, it's and it's a process getting a vinyl out. You got to get it out, put it on the thing, you got to listen to. You can't just skip tracks, or whatever, like you can on your phone. Or that sort of kind of thing. So it's more of an experience,
yes.
of listening to vinyl. Do you have? I'm assuming you have a vinyl player, right?
Actually, no. I never. Yeah, no. I was never really in. I mean, when I was a kid in the 70s, my mom had a record player, so we used to play records, and my mom used to listen to that. But I never had my own record player, because I was born in 72, so by the time early 80s, cassettes were popular already.
Oh yeah, they were all the rage, yeah.
And then by mid 80s, 86, 87, CDs were already getting big. So I never really needed to get vinyl, and so I just never did. But, of course I like hearing things on vinyl if I can.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds good. It's interesting sound. So as far as sound goes, have you done anything with film production wise type stuff?
I did work on a few projects at Soundtrack in the mid 90s, where they were recording some overdubs and some Foley to video, and also mixing video projects. They had one room at Soundtrack had a big huge screen. It was where they mixed the audio for the movie kind of thing. But it was it wasn't major motion pictures back then. It was just a smaller kind of an indie project. I worked on a couple of them, but really that's all I've ever done in that genre.
How does it work? Because I love surround sound and THX and all that fantastic stuff. In fact, when I was younger, my dad would go to the home show at the fairgrounds. They had this big home show. They had different things. So he worked in security, so he had security systems for the house. But as I was there with him, I'd walk around the floor grounds, and they have the surround sound people were there, showing off their surround sound tent booth, right? And I was in love. Holy crap, this is amazing! It sounds like you're in the theater, but you're at your house. When you recorded something like that for a major movie like that, how do they do it?
Well, the recording, they just record everything, just capture it well. That's it. And really the magic happens in the mixing. So, they don't mix those surround sound movie soundtracks in a regular studio, with two speakers left and right.
Yeah.
They actually, there'll be a studio that's the size of a small movie theater, and there'll be all the surround speakers around it. And in the middle of the room will be the big mixing desk, and that's where so the engineer and then they'll see the actual big movie on the big screen, because you have to see the screen and you have to see the movie and mix it at the same time. So that's how they do it.
So are they hitting buttons this happens on this speaker at this time? They got to orchestrate all that at the same time. It's got to be a really
no, it's just routing. So a lot of those types of consoles, it's just there's not just a mix bus of left and right. There's all different mix buses. So let's say you have, someone speaking, the main character speaking. Well, you might, in for a mix like that, you would put them in the center channel, right? That's
Right.
where the dialogue comes through. So you would choose to send them to the center channel. And then if there's music, you might send that to the left and right speakers. And then if there's ambience, like the sound of a crowd or people talking and shuffling, then you put that in the surround speakers. So you basically choose where to send each part of the mix, and that's how you build the mix.
It's got to sound like it takes forever to do that, I would think, right?
Yeah, well, it takes time for sure. But of course, there are engineers that work on that stuff every day of their life, so they can whip up a mix pretty quick.
Yeah, I would think so. It's like with podcasting. I know when I first started, I did a lot of, I guess, trying to learn this stuff and figure it out, like most podcasters do when they first get started. Like, what do I do? Like, how do I record? Like, like just figuring out any DAW to figure out how to do any kind of editing. What would you say would be what is the DAW that you use for your podcast editing?
I use Reaper, but when I teach my school, I don't teach any specific DAW, because the way I explain it to my students is that a DAW is just a tool. And as a professional audio producer or a podcast engineer or an audio engineer, I'm not beholden to one tool. I can use any tool.
That's great.
Give me any DAW. I mean, look, if I'm not familiar with the DAW, it's going to take me some time to get familiar. But as far as understanding what a DAW does, like, a professional needs to understand everything from a higher level so that you can pick and choose whatever tools you want to use. And then if you're forced to use a different tool, you should still be able to do the work because you're a professional, right?
Right. I mean, the DAW that I've used, and I've tried other ones, but the one I always go back to, the one I learned on, the one I started on, the one that I love so much is what probably most people hate, is Audacity. And what are your thoughts on Audacity? Because some people hate it, some people love it. What are your thoughts, honestly?
It's fine. Like I said, it's a tool. So here's the thing. For people who are not audio engineers, for podcasters who just want to do a podcast, just find a tool that feels good to you. Make sure you're using it properly, and that's it. It doesn't matter. It really doesn't.
Because everybody says, oh, this mine's the best, or this one's better, or I use this, or I use that, and all this other stuff. I hear it all the time, you know. But
you can argue that. I mean, I could tell you why Reaper's better than Audacity in a million different ways, but it doesn't matter. If you can use Audacity and produce your podcast and you like it and it sounds fine, then what's the problem? Yeah.
Right. And also, I think because I know the formula, I know how Audacity flows. I know the way where buttons are at. I kind of know how to use it. I know what it looks like. And it works on kind of everything. And I learned on it because it was a free. If you go to Google, like, easy to use podcast DAWs, I think Audacity is on the list. Probably, number one on the list. And so that's why I got started. I tried using GarageBand on my Mac, and I'm like, I don't know what to do with this thing. I'm confused. I tried Pro Tools, and I'm like, I don't understand that either. So
yeah, I mean, one time when I first got my Mac, when I was switching from PC to Mac, at one point Reaper had an update and then it stopped working. And I was like, for like a whole day, I was like, oh no, I'm going to have to use something else. So I bought Logic Pro on my Mac and I opened it up and I was like, ugh. And I couldn't even click on it's like you can't even just click anywhere on the desk, on the, where the tracks are. You can't click in that area. And I was like, this is ridiculous. And but of course I already bought it, but I was like, I could never use that DAW. So again, whatever people like, whatever they feel good using, just use that. That's it.
Yeah, I mean, so I like it. And I think now, I don't know if you noticed, but Audacity has had a few major updates to where now you can do real-time effects, and it doesn't do, what do you call it, the destructive editor. It's supposedly no longer, but you can still you can still do some stuff, and you have to go back and change stuff. But I think that's what I was always doing, was just going, if I screwed up, I would go hit the back button, and I would do multiple takes and stuff, trying to make one pass, save that, make another pass as like a backup, just in case, I screw things up. So as far as like podcast editing and things like that, what are some good practices you would say, give advice for any podcaster, really?
Yeah, so editing audio is all about, editing podcast audio is all about naturalness and the feel. It should feel like a normal conversation. It should flow like a normal conversation. So you don't want to edit things too tightly, because if you edit things too tightly, then every time I speak, and then the next sentence starts, and then I say the next thing, and then I say the next thing, and then I say the next thing, and then I say the next thing. And that's too tight. So you have to, the flow of the conversation should flow naturally. And when you make edits, you should listen to your edits and make sure they sound natural, because after you make an edit, the end listener should never even know that you made an edit.
Right. Yeah, that's what I always say. Edit as if because people say you don't edit your show. I say, yes, I do, but you can't tell because I edit in a way to make it sound like you didn't tell. It's like you think about a movie, like when they make a movie a scene or if something happens on the screen, you're like, wow, that's crazy. Look at that, and I mean, obviously it was special effects, but you make it think you don't see the special effects.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You just see the thing that they want you to see. That's it.
So far as editing, so you said make sure it doesn't get too quick when you do your editing, chopping. People do. That's one thing I did at the beginning of I think every podcaster just begins to do that, is they see those little gaps. Oh, let me cut that gap out. And then you see every gap is a gap you got to cut. And then eventually it does sound very robotic when you're talking, not very natural. So, but as far as let's start from the beginning. Say your microphone itself. What is good practice to get good audio with the microphone?
Yeah, so there's kind of two main aspects of recording that are going to determine how you. Well, let's say three main aspects that are going to determine how you sound. Number one is the microphone itself. You just need to have a decent microphone. Like you can buy a $100 microphone. The ATR 2100 is a great example. Any decent $100 mic is good enough for podcasting. So what you don't want to do is use a really cheap mic that sounds terrible, or use your earbuds. Just don't use a mic that sounds like garbage. Just use a decent mic that sounds good. That's number one. And then, if you have a decent mic, then you never have to worry about that for the rest of your life. So that's, check that one off the list. The second thing is microphone technique. You have to learn how to speak into a microphone. You can't get really close. You can't get really close and then get really far away and mumble and then now I'm back close to the mic and now I'm over here. I'm mumbling. See, I'm mumbling. You can't hear me. So you have to stay about the same distance from your mic the whole time and kind of speak into the mic or past the mic, but stay the same proximity to the mic the whole time. And that alone will go a long way toward the listener being able to hear you properly all the time. So you don't, you just heard me mumble. You couldn't hear what I said, right?
Right.
That's bad. The listener's going to miss half of a sentence, and they're going to, if you do that 4 or 5 times in a row, they're going to turn off the podcast because they can't hear half of what you're saying. So microphone technique is the second thing. And the third thing is the environment. You don't want to be in a noisy environment. You don't want, fans in the background or dogs jumping around or people stamping on the floor upstairs or trucks driving by. Try to just set up in a room or some environment where it's pretty quiet.
But what if you can't? What if your options are kind of limited? Say you have a noisy something next door, or you have a gardener going on out, the house next door mowing their lawn or something. And what do you do in that situation?
Well, either you don't record or you just record with the noise. I mean, but that's not, podcasters should start off thinking deliberately about how can I create a space where I'm going to record decent audio. That's it. Figure that out first. If you can't figure that out, okay. If you're next to a highway and there's going to be literal road noise and big trucks honking their horns in every one of your episodes, then you have to decide, do I want to have a podcast where there's big trucks and going and horns? Do you want that in your show or not? And if the answer is, well, I don't mind the horns, then fine. Record your podcast. If the answer is, well, no, I don't want that noise because it's terribly distracting, it's horrible, and my pretty much 0 listeners are going to make it all the way to the end of my episodes, then you got to figure something out. You got to figure out a different place that's not noisy. I mean, it's that simple. There's nothing more to it.
Yeah, I know that. I heard that the closet is the best place. What are your thoughts on closet recording podcasts?
Yeah, it's great. If that's a place, closets are great because they have a lot of clothing and they're usually the floor is carpeted as well. So it a lot of absorptive material. So yeah, if you sit in your closet with a microphone, then there's not going to there's going to be very few reflections, and the mic is going to pick up your voice and not many reflections. And of course, and if you shut the door of the closet, then it's not going to pick up anything, from outside the closet. So yeah, closets are great.
Now, what about like with us? Our problem was that because we have on the Chris and Christine show, two of us, same room with like we originally had high ceilings and wooden floors and all that, but it was our bedroom, but it still sounded pretty good. Like there's always going to be crossplay. It seems like even though we try to minimize it the best we can, like what is your advice for having say two people, same room to eliminate some of the crossbleed and that sort of stuff?
Yeah, number one, you should sit facing each other, which means that your microphones are going to be pointing away from each other. And you should have cardioid microphones. We can talk about that if you want, but that's just the pickup pattern. Ooh, okay. And then the other thing is both people need to have their mouth close to the mic. And when I say close, I mean 2 to 3 inches.
Like almost eating it pretty much, right?
Almost eating it. Because if you move back 6 or 8 inches, the signal to noise ratio just gets destroyed, and then that's when the bleed is nasty. So if both people are really close to their mics and the microphones are pointing away from each other, so they're picking up less of each of what each other is picking up, that will go a long way toward that separation and not having a ton of bleed.
That's what we've been doing. That's what we were doing, I think, from the very beginning. We had a good space. I think we were sitting probably a good 10 feet apart from each other. But even then,
that's good too, yeah.
Yeah, even then, there's still bleed and things like that. And so what I have done is, in that situation, try to make sure you can get separate audio tracks. Of course, in the early days, I didn't know nothing about nothing. So everything was on one track. And that's what I was working with, So,
yeah.
But if you can get everything on separate tracks, and then you can still kind of like eliminate the bleed off each track as you kind of do your editing. I guess it kind of helps, for the most part. And then we mix it back together. That's what I have done. If it's really bad, for the most part, I'll listen to it and I'll say, well, it's not that bad. So I'll just not really worry about. I'll do like a noise reduction tool in Audacity to kind of get rid of the bleed. But even with some of these plugins, some of these tools, you can kind of screw up some of the original audio. The deeper you go down into, these plugins, I would assume, right?
Oh yeah, if you use a processor the wrong way, you'll definitely ruin the audio instead of fixing it. That happens you can do that with anything. But what I was going to say with you too is, well, first of all, you said you used a denoise, a noise reduction.
Yeah.
So if you're in a room that's very reverby, there's a lot of, like you said, hardwood floors and windows and bare walls. First of all, that's not a good space to record in. Like that, just flat out. If you had to pick a room to record in, that would not be it. Okay. But if that is the case, then you wouldn't use noise reduction. You would use a de-reverb would be the correct tool to use.
A de-reverb, huh?
Yeah.
Where do you find, is that a special plugin you got to buy, or is it available?
Yeah, there's a bunch of different de-reverb plugins. Yeah.
So what does that do exactly to the audio?
Well, these plugins have been well trained with machine learning to recognize the difference between reverb and a person's voice, and so they can actually reduce the amount of reverb while leaving the person's voice as it is.
Check that out.
But of course, it's like any other plugin. If you overdo it, you're going to start ruining the voice. It's no different in that sense. But
yeah. Well, I mean, all these tools are wonderful, and I think for me, it's like, what can I do to speed up the process from record to publish? I know some people will spend weeks editing an episode. Me personally, I don't have that kind of time. In fact, I have like literally no time. So I have to figure out the quickest and fastest way to go from speaking to uploading. So I know that.
Well, that's why it's so important to solve these problems before you hit record. Like, is that the only room you can record in with the high ceiling, wood floors, and a lot of glass? Like, no, that's not the right room. So, you can save yourself an hour of using a de-reverb by just choosing a different room. Like, so that's the thing. Avoiding problems is way easier than fixing them in post, right?
Yeah, definitely. Because editing is fun and all, but I know some shows they do spend. I've heard of 2 weeks on a single episode editing, And that just sounds nuts to me. I mean, but
well, those are probably shows that have a lot of, there's probably a lot of audio production involved.
Yeah,
with that. That's not just a one-on-one interview.
Yeah, that's true.
I guarantee you.
Yeah, it's a lot of like sound effects, and every sentence has a sound effect that's associated with it, and that sort of thing. That's where all the heavy lifting when it comes to like figuring out all this. That's gonna sound like it takes forever, but to each their own. I think people can podcast however they want to podcast. It's their show. Do it however they want to do it. So when it comes to podcasting, in your opinion, Chris, what do you think makes a good podcast versus a bad podcast?
To me, it's all about the authenticity and the energy. So you can hear people when they speak, and they're putting on the announcer voice, and welcome to my podcast. How are you doing today? Okay, terrific. Like, that's inauthentic. So people who just talk like a normal human being, that's authentic. Listeners resonate with that. So that's one thing, being authentic. And then energy is the other thing. I remember years ago when because I had written a personal development book, and I was doing presentations and I was doing interviews with that. And I had a coach who was like an interview coach. Like if you go on the radio or you go on TV or anything, this coach said the number one thing is energy. You got to bring the energy. If you don't bring the energy, if you go onto a show and you don't really bring too much energy to the when you're speaking. Okay, you see how I just brought the entire show down, right?
Yeah. There's a lot of podcasts that do that. I think because that's how they naturally. I think it's because they want to talk with their buddies, or maybe they want to talk about whatever, and they're just sitting around talking like they normally would around the water cooler talk, like you would in the office. Like, hey, what'd you do last week? Okay, great. Like that kind of tone. I think.
But within that tone, there's a natural energy.
What do you mean?
I mean, I could sit. Look, so Chris, what did after work? What did yesterday? What did you do? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah,
that's horrible. But if I'm just speaking normally, like, hey, Chris, so after work yesterday, what did you do? Like, I'm not screaming and yelling, but there's natural energy in what I said, right?
Yeah, and also I think people have to realize people are listening on the other end. Like when I do our podcast, this podcast or the other podcast, like I just imagine I'm talking in front of a crowd of people, like I'm on stage or something. Like I'm in a theater. I'm not quite the like dramatic theater voice, but realizing that yes, somebody is listening to this on the other end. And I think like what I was gonna say about podcasts, like podcast interviews, for example, people seem to get kind of like in too much in the weeds of like. I think like, hey, remember the time we went here? Oh, that was so funny. Remember that? And the listener's like, what are you talking about? I don't know what you're even talking about. So that does happen too. And I think a good interview really is basically like a conversation that you want to eavesdrop in on. You got to realize people are doing that at the same time,
Totally.
Yeah. So as far as like your podcast, you said good podcast. Now a bad podcast says lack of energy, but as far as sound quality goes, I know you're an audio engineer, so your level of sound quality is probably higher. Your palette, I guess, for that was probably a little higher than most people. I would say most podcast listeners probably can tolerate more bad audio than you probably could. I would think. So if a show's got bad audio, how far can you go before you just shut it off?
Yeah, well, I agree. So first of all, being an audio engineer and teaching people how to produce podcasts at the highest level, for some reason, everyone thinks I'm an audio snob and that I think every show should go out and buy $5,000 worth of audio gear. And if they don't spend $5,000, then I'm going to turn my nose up to them and scoff at them and tell them that they're mere plebs that sound like garbage. That's not true. I actually agree with Dave Jackson's take on this whole thing. Your audio doesn't have to be world class. Your audio just has to be good enough. It has to be good enough so that when the listener listens, they can hear every word and it sounds decent. And the big thing is The quality of audio should not even come into the listener's mind. They should not even think, oh, this sounds terrible, or oh, this sounds great. The quality should be good enough where they can just listen and get the content without having to even think about audio quality. So good enough is good enough. You don't have to be world class. You just have to have decent equipment, use decent mic technique, be in a decent place. That's it. There's nothing else to say besides that.
Yeah, I think what I've heard from a lot of different shows is where the audio starts to go downhill is when they have a remote guest come in. Usually it's via Zoom. It could be Squadcast. It could be Riverside. It could be a number of things. What would you tell a podcaster ways to improve that?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, I spend a lot of time in podcast engineering school talking to the students about this very subject. How to sound check guests, how to, what to send them beforehand so that they can prepare as best they can. So, in a perfect world, you would hope that every guest had a decent microphone and was in a quiet room and all that stuff, but they're not. So you're right. This is very tricky and it's not easy sometimes. Some people will connect to the show. The guest will have a good microphone and all that. But a lot of times they won't. A lot of times they'll just have earbuds. So there's a million different situations and there's a million different things to check out or to sound check the guest. But basically, look, you got to do the best you can. Whatever they have, you have to do the best you can. So, simple things like, again, if there's an air conditioner, 3 feet from their microphone that's blowing air, like, hey, can you turn that off? Like that's that's that.
And they'll say, well, you can hear that? Well, yeah, I can hear that.
Exactly. And if there's a dog barking in the room, you're like, can you put your dog somewhere else for the duration of the podcast? And they go, oh, sure. So you just have to, again, before you hit record, solve all the issues. A big one I'll tell you is when guests are using earbuds and the microphone on the earbuds, when the mic is on the wire.
Oh,
right?
And it rubs their shirt.
And it rubs the shirt. That's
and you tell them and they're like, what? You can hear, like they don't know.
So you got to make sure they don't do that. And if they start doing it, you got to stop recording and say, hey, hold on. Because that earbuds microphone on the wire rubbing against a shirt, that's literally one of the only sounds or noises that is virtually impossible to remove. Like, I don't care if you have Isotope, you can have the best software known to man. You can't get rid of that. So, and you can't listen to it. If you're listening to a podcast and you start to hear that, it's hard to listen to. You can't listen to it.
Right, that screechy kind of rubbing sound.
It's nasty. I know, absolutely nasty.
I know, but it feels weird when you're talking to a guest. You're like, hey, hang on a second, Joe. Can you please pick up your wire off your shirt, please? It kind of disrupts the conversation. So now you have to go back and kind of rebuild the conversation again, and hopefully maybe you can edit all that out, of course. But then it's like, and another thing I always hear too is, I think you've mentioned this too, is physically forgetting to hit record. Going into a conversation with a guest and then have to say, by the way, can we just do that again? Because I forgot. That's never happened to me. I've seen it happen, but it's never happened to me. And it's like my biggest nightmare. So when I record a guest, I know you probably do the same thing too, because I only started recently doing this because I bought the new Rodecaster, but is having a double recording when you record, especially like we're using Clean Feed right now. And I have it recording in Clean Feed, of course, and I've got it recording on my Rodecaster also. I think you said you also do another section. You do 3 recordings?
Sometimes, yeah. So I normally use, I think, Riverside or Squadcast. So that's one recording. And by the way, those are similar to Clean Feed, what we're using right now, of course. I also... the interface I'm using is a Sound Devices MixPre 6, so that's also a recorder. So I record a backup there, and then also on my computer, I can run something like Audio Hijack or even Reaper. And you can just run some app, either your DAW or an app to record another backup. So, and the idea is, if you're listening to this and you're like, why are you recording in 3 places? Well, they're just backups. They're just backups, because if clean feed goes down, you lose all that audio. Well, then what? Well, you got to have a backup. So, and I'm a crazy person. I'm a crazy audio guy. So I record, sometimes I'll record in 2 places, sometimes 3, but never more than 3. But it's just to have a backup.
Yeah, I mean, I've been using Clean Feed for probably 2 or 3 years now, for the most part, and I have never lost a file from Clean Feed. I've had issues, but mainly it's because of my own equipment. I think I was using the problem I had. I think it was an older computer I had, and the fan and the heat sink was just covered in dust, like big old dust bunny on the thing. And I think what was causing a glitching kind of staticky sound on our end, like almost like a garbly sound. It wasn't like an internet glitch sound. It's more like a garbly sound. Because I noticed it happened just recording directly to the computer locally, not just over the internet, but just locally. Same thing would happen. So I think it was the computer. Eventually, I upgrade. Now I'm on a MacBook Pro with the M1 chip, and it seems to be working, pretty good for the most part. And I'm now just have the new Rodecaster 2. Have you had a chance to play around with the Rodecaster at all?
No, but I just did a post on this. But yeah, no, the Rodecaster, even the first version and now the second version, are just, I know they're great. I've seen them in person. I've moved the faders. I've twisted some knobs. I do not own one, but I know that I know from people who have tested it and everything that that they are really good units. So definitely Rode, and Rode makes good stuff. So.
Yeah, so I'm Roded out, I guess. I got the microphone, and I got the Rodecaster Pro 2, and I bought it because I was gonna pick up the first gen because they marked them down in price. I'm like, first gen, it's on sale, great, because the 2 came out, and my wife's like, "Why are you gonna spend that much money on that? Why don't you buy the real deal? Why don't you buy the top dog one?" So I'm like, okay, that's what I'll do. So I got the Rodecaster. I'm using the Rodecaster 2. I haven't gotten too much into the weeds into this thing because I know you can really fine tune like the de-esser and all that into each track. You can really fine tune. I do have it set up for the microphone I'm using and just basic stuff, and I figured out the basics, and it's quite an amazing thing. I think what they try to do with Rode is that I know that you probably have like different racks of gear. I would think I try to combine all that into one toy. Someone mentioned, I think on YouTube, that they put like $2,000 worth of equipment into this little thing.
Yeah.
Which I think is, but I know it's not cheap. It's still, none of this stuff's cheap. It's $700 for this thing, which isn't. I mean, most basic podcasters are, they're like, I ain't spending that much money on anything. So, like their computer probably doesn't even cost that much. And so for them, what I recommend always is getting the Zoom PodTrack P4. Have you played with that?
No, but I've seen that too. I haven't heard much about it, but I've seen that unit. Is it good?
I have one. I bought it at full price. I feel like a sucker because now they dropped the price like they usually do on this stuff. It's only $150, and I can't think of anything podcasting related that's this good for that price. That can do as much stuff. The Zoom PodTrack can essentially do almost everything the Rodecaster can do. But in something its size, something you can put in your palm of your hand, runs on batteries. You can take it anywhere. You can do 4 microphones XLR. I think it's got like 70 dB of gain or so on the thing for this little tiny toy. It's got 4 headphone jacks for 4 people can have their own headphone.
Wow.
It's got what else? It's got a sound pad, a 4-channel sound pad. You can upload stuff to it, whatever. What's it got? 5 separate tracks, I think, if you include the sound pad. 4 microphones, but some of the microphones you can make it as like a USB track. Like, say we're recording this through that, I can record it on that and this for $150. Like, I think it's a bargain.
Yeah, it's a bargain, but with you gotta, like, that's a red flag though. Like, you gotta, like, if one company's selling something for $700 and then someone else selling it for $150, I guarantee the audio components are not as good. For instance, Zoom. You're talking about the PodTrack P4. I own a Zoom H6, and I have to tell you that the inputs and the mic pre's, they're not the best quality, and you can distort them easily.
Oh, I'm sure you can.
Like,
yeah.
If you go even close to 0, it starts distorting. And they have a digital limiter, which is absolutely useless, like literally useless. It's like, okay, after it clips, we're going to limit it. Thanks. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Too late.
Does nothing for me. So the point is, it might be very cheap, but you have to understand that the audio components are much cheaper. And so you got to be careful. So, I mean, and then you look at the Sound Devices Mix Pre stuff, right? I'm using a Mix Pre 6. That costs $950.
Wow.
But guess what? The mic preamps on that thing are absolutely world class.
Wow.
Like next level world class. So my point is not to sell you on to tell you to spend more money. My point is the audio components within gear is vastly different between these price points, right?
Yeah, I would think so. I do know that the so little history, a little thing on the Zoom PodTrack P4 is that I think it's only 16-bit and 44.1 is what it records at. So it's not the greatest,
right?
But when you listen back to it and you play stuff, record stuff back to it, to my ears, it sounds really, really good. I think for any like new podcast show that's on a budget that needs to get like 4 microphones recorded in one place, like we're going to record at Joe's house or whatever, you got
totally
like that thing you can put in your pocket,
totally,
and like have some microphones and you record directly onto the thing on a memory card, and then you can take that thing and transfer the files to whatever DAW you want to use and edit how you want. It's all separate tracks and all that great stuff. In fact, I recommend that if you're starting out and money is a problem, you don't want to spend a bunch of money on stuff, and you want something simple and easy to use, I recommend the Zoom PodTrack P4, and it's only $150 right now. I paid like $200 for it when I got it. So they dropped the price. I wonder if they're going to come out with a new one with like, it's better. It's like just like the Rodecaster came out with a new one. Everybody kept saying, "Oh, they're not coming out with the new Rodecaster," and I say, "Wait a second, they got to be coming out with a new one." "Oh, no, this one's the best, man. I don't see what they can possibly do to this thing. This thing's already great. I'm sure it is great." But Rode, came out with a new one, and it's even better. So I mean, I love playing with this thing. It's great. I recommend getting it if you have the money.
Yeah, but your point about the P4 is well taken for sure. For $150, all you got to do is make sure you don't clip the preamps, and then you're good to go. That's great.
Like I do notice when we first used it, because I was using a Behringer audio interface. In fact, I still have it. It's right there. I have to give it away. I don't know, but we were using that, and I think the gain on the preamps were something like 53 dB. And so I had the knobs turned like normally, where I would keep it at like 3/4 of a dial, I guess, to get the good volume. And then I did the same thing on the P4 because it also has little knobs too. And it was cranking. It was cranking. It was so loud when I put the audio files back over the computer. I'm like, wow, we're like blasting each other because it went from like 53 dB to 70 dB again on the P4. So you got to be careful with that stuff when you really mess around with your audio recording. So when you do record your audio, like you're just recording directly into it to edit it later. What volume level do you like to kind of keep it at when you do the actual recording part?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously you want to record at a strong, healthy level, but you don't really want to clip, obviously. So you just got to find that happy medium. Every device is different. Every meter is different. Just the literal meter that you're looking at the level on is different. So the best thing to do is just do some tests. Do a test, put the mic preamp at, 50%, like 12 o'clock, right? Pointing straight up, and just talk for 10 seconds, then crank it up to 60%, talk for 10 seconds, crank it up to 70%, talk for 10 seconds. And then after you're done recording, bring that file into your computer and open it up in your wave editor and look at it. And you'll see, oh, the 50% setting was way too low. 60 was okay. 70%, that looks good. It's nice and strong and healthy, but it's not coming close to clipping. And that's it. Now you know where to set your preamp, and that's it.
But when you actually do record, I know heard some people say that obviously if you record too loud, you get the clipping and all that stuff. But if you go too low, could that be an issue too when it comes to re-editing the podcast or anything?
Not really too much. I mean, it's not really too much of a big deal. But when you're recording in 16-bit, it's more of an issue. So one of the benefits of recording in 24-bit is that 24-bit. The resolution of 24-bit recordings, it's not just better than 16-bit. It is way better, like 1,000 times better. It records in such high resolution compared to 16-bit. So if you're using 24-bit, yeah, your level could be low. Your level could be very low. And guess what? It doesn't matter because the resolution is so high that when you bring it into your computer and you boost it up 25 dB, it's still going to sound really good. With 16-bit, it can get a little grainy or something if the level's too low.
So is that kind of like, say you take a picture with like, say, a 5 megapixel camera and try to blow it up versus like a 24 pixel camera and you blow it up, it looks like that kind of thing?
Perfect analogy. You nailed it.
So what really is the difference, say, because I hear this like the, the refresh rate is like 44.1 is like CD standard, and like most devices like the Rodecaster is 48 hertz and CleanFeed runs things at 48 hertz.
Yeah, that's the sample rate, not the refresh rate.
Oh, okay, sample rate. So what's the difference then? What does that mean?
Sample rate is just how many snapshots the computer takes of the analog audio signal every second. So let's just say 48 kilohertz, which is what I mainly use. So 44.1 is good and 48 are good. Both are good. It doesn't really matter which one you use. But let's just use 48 kilohertz for the example. That means every second, like picture my microphone audio going into the computer, right? Every second of audio that goes into the computer is taking 48,000 snapshots of that analog signal and digitizing it.
Wow.
Yeah. That's what sample rate is.
I actually did a little demo on this. I went into Audacity, and because you can change the sample rate in there, and I changed it from, I went to like 8, I think 8,000 was the lowest you can go, to the highest, and I just said something, and then I zoomed in really, zoomed in so much that all you see is dots. Like you don't even see the lines anymore. And you can see the dot spacing is really spaced out quite a bit with the lower frequency. And then when to the high frequency, they're like really close together.
You mean the lower sample rate versus the higher sample rate?
Yeah, correct. Yeah. So it was, you actually can see that for yourself when you do a test like that, go from one extreme to the other.
Yeah. And you can, and even more practical than that, that's good. But even more practical is you take the sample rate, you divide it in half, and that's actually the highest frequency that you're able to capture with that sample rate. So 48 kilohertz, that means the highest frequency you can capture is 24 kilohertz.
Really? Why is that?
Because the analog signal is basically, I'm simplifying it, but the analog signal is basically a sine wave, and you have to sample the audio when the sine wave is, on the positive crest of the sine wave, and then also when it's below zero on the negative crest below zero. You have to sample both of them to get to understand what frequency that is. So that's why you just cut it in half, and that's as high as it can sample.
So how high can your devices go with your sample rates, frequency rate?
Well, I think the Mix Pre goes to 96 kilohertz, but for podcasting, that's overkill. For music, you can do 96 for music. That's fine. But like for podcasting, 48 or 44.1 are just fine.
My other Behringer, I think it said it went to 190 or 196 or
192.
192. That's what it was. 192 is what it says it can do. I don't know how to really now. If you do something vocal wise at that, does it change the sound at all or anything?
Well, it's a much higher resolution. What we're talking about is we're talking about digitizing an analog signal, right?
Yeah.
Because audio, when it goes through your microphone, it flows through an analog cable, right?
Yeah.
And we're trying to digitize that. So the more the more samples you take of that audio, then basically the higher resolution. Because the digital recording is just approximating the analog signal, right?
Interesting.
That's what that's technically what it's doing. So if you take more snapshots, then it's a higher resolution representation of that analog signal. So that's all it is. But when you get to 48 or 96 or 192, like no human can really hear the difference between that. I mean, again, those higher sample rates are mostly used for music, because when you're dealing with musical instruments, and then you're dealing with many musical instruments, and then you're mixing them all together, and then you're using a lot of plug-in processing, it's better to have a higher sample rate. Think of, the higher your sample rate, let's say you want to use an EQ or a compressor within your DAW, right? Well, if you're giving your DAW 48 kilohertz sample rate, that's fine. But maybe you recorded in 192, and now you're giving that to your compressor or EQ. So your EQ has a lot more information to deal with. It has a more clear representation of the actual audio. So the EQ can do a better job at higher sample rates, right? So anyway, so what I'm saying is with music, that all comes into play. With podcasting, we don't need to worry about that really.
So what would be for a podcast? Would you say a good sample, a good rate to record at? Like what would be a good level?
Like I said, 44.1 or 48 kilohertz is fine, and 24-bit is great. So I record everything in 24-bit, 48 kilohertz, and that works great. And I keep everything. Every stage of my production stays in that resolution, 24-bit, 48 kilohertz, until the very final phase of production, which is when I create the MP3.
Now, when you create the MP3, what do you keep it at when it's done there? I know there's certain levels.
I just keep normal, like mono at 64 kilobits per second and stereo at 128 kilobits per second.
I think some podcast hosts will convert it over to 128. I've heard, anyways, no matter what you put up to it. That's what I've heard. I think 128 for MP3s, I think it do sound fairly decent. I know that some people like to crank it up and do the extreme higher than 300 or 200 or whatever they like to do. As far as like a podcast goes, does that make much of a difference, really, to the listener?
Like I said, 64 for mono, 128 for stereo. Those are kind of unofficial standards because they sound good enough. Let's put it that way. And especially if you're producing good sounding audio, then those rates are just fine. But I do know, some people for mono, instead of 64, they like to do it at 96. Okay, fine. That probably helps a little. And some people, instead of 128 stereo, they want to do 192 stereo. That's fine too. When you're creating and when you're basically saving your episodes as MP3s, you're encoding it as an MP3. The difference between 128 and 192 is, the average listener is not going to hear that.
Right.
You could probably even go lower than that, and some people might not hear it. But if you go too low, then it'll become an issue. So.
Yeah, we had a problem, I noticed, on our Chris and Christine show. I think it was episode 11 or something. It was the first time doing an interview. In fact, I wasn't available for the interview. I had to go work. So we did the interview like over the phone. Like everything was done like through a phone call. Like even our side was all phone, So the quality was gotta be, I don't know, maybe 8,000 or something. It was like really, really low or something like that. So when I did the final mix down and I mixed everything together, even with our part recorded, say at 44.1, at the beginning of the show, for some reason we mixed it all down as an MP3 because I listened back to it after I was done, after I was up and everything. I was like, why does it sound weird? It sounded like bad AM radio. Like it was so low, and I couldn't figure out.
I'm shocked that in Audacity you can't pick your exact sample rate. So that's kind of shocking to me.
I think it gave me a range, if I remember. I think it gave you a range of like 100 to like 200, just an example here, something like that.
If that's true, then that's another example of why Audacity is not the most professional audio software in the world. And because if it's going to do that to you and you have no control over that, that's kind of silly in my opinion.
But that was one of our first episodes, and I didn't know. And also too, back then I didn't know to record things in a waveform. I was recording everything in MP3.
That's not good. Yep.
That's what I was doing. So I was also recording everything as MP3. So that probably had something to do with it, because our recording was MP3 plus their MP3. Maybe we mixed them together. Now, when you take multiple things, say like, so it shouldn't matter. So it shouldn't really matter. So say you recorded something at like 120, 190, 192, and then you recorded something at 48, and then recorded something at 44, but you mixed them all together in like one new mix, and then you save that as an MP3. Should it make a difference or no?
Well, yeah. So here's the way it works. If, for instance, I'll use Reaper as an example. Reaper is the DAW that I use. I can take any sound clips I want and throw them into Reaper. So I could take with different bit rates and different sample rates and all that. But in my Reaper session, I define what my Reaper session is. So is for the sample rate. So I pick 48 kilohertz. So I can jumble, I can put any audio format, any sample rate into my Reaper session. And then what happens is when I render the mix, when I'm rendering the final mix, which I render as a WAV file, and I convert it to MP3 later, but when I render the mix as a WAV file, I choose the bit rate, I choose the sample rate. And then Reaper, and again, I already told you, I choose 24-bit and 48 kilohertz. So when Reaper mixes down that episode for me, it does all the conversions, it takes care of everything, and just spits out a WAV file at 24-bit, 48 kilohertz, and it sounds just like it sounded in the DAW, and that's it.
Fantastic. Well, that's some excellent advice, Chris. I appreciate that. That's great, man. So, hey, Chris, it's been so fantastic having you on the show today, man. I really, really appreciate you stopping by today. So where can everybody find out all about you and all your wonderful stuff?
Yeah, it's just podcastengineeringschool.com, and I have one main course which teaches people how to produce podcasts professionally at a professional level, and most of my students, their goal is to work from home producing podcasts and earn a great living, and upwards of 6 figures if they do it right. And so that's what I'm teaching people. People love it. A lot of podcasters who they've been producing their own show for years, and they're like, hey, maybe I can actually get trained and be a professional and earn some money, either earn some money on the side or maybe even full time. Some young people, they're looking for a career, and they're like, hey, you're telling me I can sit at home and do recording sessions and produce podcasts and make a great living? I want some of that. So that's what my school does, and everything's at podcastengineeringschool.com.
That is fantastic. Well, Chris, you have yourself a great rest of your day, buddy. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris. It's great being here, and I love your energy and authenticity, and this was a lot of fun, man. So thank you.